society, and we have to have the basic social net in place to protect in case the community level of support is not there. We know that I mean, it's a basic international human rights standard. We have to have those basic protections in place. But at the same time, of course, government has a role in helping to enable and facilitate and support local community action, big community action, working with business. I mean, just as a very specific example, we released a report this morning which again talked about the lack of affordable housing in Australia. It's a big problem for us. Now, one of the best examples of the solution for that is to bring together community organisations with the private sector, but we know that that wasn't going to happen without the government having a role in putting some money into that. And we are starting to see the benefits of that coming together.
Let me just ask Philip, I want to hear from the Minister after that, but I just want to ask Philip, to what degree do you take the government in Britain, do you take the government out of the equation? After all, you still have a national health system. I mean...
Well, as you all saw at the Olympics opening ceremony, nurses cavorting for far too long on National Health Service beds. Look, the point I'm trying to argue isn't to eliminate the state. We need the state, but the state can only go so far. So in Britain, for example, where we have universal healthcare, we already have a disastrous postcode lottery. In certain parts of England, life expectancy can vary by up to 30 years. The point is, how do you get from universal healthcare to effective healthcare? And what we've found is actually, what's wrong with the universal model is it assumes everybody needs the same thing in the same way. And precisely because people vary and they need very different things, and a national state service at present can't deliver that, that's why we have the terrible health inequalities we have in Britain. So what I advocate is that people need what they need, that we need to deliver the right thing to people, and that needs local control, local power and local needs and local demand.
Now we should hear from the Minister, because that is effectively what Tony Abbott is talking about in terms of the health system.
Well, that's right, but look, there are some profound differences between the UK and Australia, I think, that need to be sort of brought into this debate. But first of all, can I say that this is a really good debate to have, and it's not the first time a writer has tried to sort of fill this gap between individuals and the state or the market, and sort of this breakdown of family and community. And I agree with the second questioner that a lot of this is due to social change, much of it very, very good, that is largely irreversible. But how do you fill that gap? Well, in Australia, we have a much smaller state than the UK. Our state has typically spent about 35% of GDP. The UK spends about 50% of their GDP on government services. And the difference there of about $200 billion for the Australian economy is a vibrant community sector that Cassandra represents that has done the sorts of things that Philip is talking about in the UK. So Europe and Great Britain went down this path post-war of largely building a better society in the wake of the Depression and World War II based on a big state. We didn't do that. We had a relatively small state, one of the smallest spends on government services in the OECD, and nurtured that community sector in a way that I think Philip would like to see in the UK.
Yeah, okay. Philip, can I just interrupt just for a moment? Yeah. Sure. I know you're not actually going to be advising Tony Abbott, but you are going to be meeting him and members of the shadow ministry, his shadow ministry. Are there any specific areas you'll be telling them that could be changed by this big society idea in Australia?
Well, I think sort of Tony Abbott has actually spoken rather convincingly about strong communities, and he's proposed the ideas around local controls of hospitals and local control of schools, which I think, people, I think, broadly understand. I'm going to suggest he goes much further. I'm going to suggest that what he actually does is actually create conditions whereby local people can determine the services they want. And they can, for instance, one of the best things you can do, take, for example, leukemia sufferers who've never had, in many parts of the country, specific services for them because there aren't enough of them to warrant it. What we've done in Britain is we've personalised healthcare budgets so that people have their own budgets, and then leukemia sufferers can come together and fund a centre-specific healthcare that actually meets their needs. So what I'm trying to suggest is go much more local. You need much more radical localism to deliver the next step change to educational and health excellence that people need and demand. And I totally take your point. Australia is an example for Britain for exactly the reasons that you talked about. But the idea, if you look elsewhere in broader modern trends, where it's going is in crisis. And Australia is not isolated from the world. And unless you constantly try to recognise the trends that you want to resist, you have to be aware of the way the world's going. And these proposals will, I think, position Australia far better for the future.
OK, all right. Yes, Brigade.
I mean, I think we are doing a lot of that in Australia already. I mean, we do have local area health boards. We do have individualised funding for children with disabilities or adults with disability, at least in New South Wales. We have moved foster care into the non-government sector because we think it delivers a more individualised response. I take your point. I think we are increasingly a person-centred community instead of a community-centred community. And I think what's missing, because we will never get to the point that you're talking about of a great big caring sharing family, whilst we don't relieve some of the other pressures, we have to really promote volunteerism. I mean, the best kept secret in New South Wales is life in country towns where people know each other, where they trust each other, where they volunteer to work together for the Rotary raises money for the local PCYC and so on. We have to give people time in their lives for volunteering, and we have to be able to enable people to trust each other again in cities. And that's what's missing.
You know, first of all, we have relatively high rates of volunteering already in Australia, and our big concern is that if this message is that the glue of society is going to be filled by further volunteering and the withdrawing of funding support, then we risk who is going to put that time in?
Can I just ask?
For women who already do a lot of unpaid caring work, as you know from your time as Sex Discrimination Commissioner, who already do a lot of volunteering at the community level, but on the other hand, face serious poverty in later life because they're not in paid work in rates that would be in other countries.
Okay, I want to bring in Peter Singer here, listening to the argument going backwards and forwards about big society versus big government. What are your thoughts? And let's bear in mind you live in the United States, where, we've just seen Mitt Romney take on someone who really wants to make small government smaller as his vice presidential candidate.
I think Paul Ryan's ideas about slashing the state are really crazy. And in fact, the Catholic bishops, who I don't always agree with of the United States, have come out with a statement saying that Ryan's proposal would actually hurt hungry children, the vulnerable seniors. It's really going to hurt the weakest sections of society. And that does worry me, seeing the United States. And the idea that Philip is talking about more localisation and control worries me too, because in the United States, schools are locally funded. They're not funded either at the federal or at the state level, basically. They're funded from local property taxes. So it's obvious what that means. It does give the communities more control, but it means that the wealthy communities have better schools than the poor communities.
But the poor school communities are already in trouble anyway.
Well,
and the point that they're already
make it worse.
The point is, look, it won't make it worse actually because it's already about as bad as it can be.
No.
The point is the state is already failing in many Western societies to help the poor, and education is one of those reasons. For instance, the best indicator of a child's outcome in the United Kingdom is the postcode in which they're born. And that tells you that the rhetoric that we have is education, it's the same everywhere, so everything's OK. It isn't. The countries with the highest rate of social immobility are the United Kingdom, Italy, for different reasons, and the United States.
So can I just ask you, just to pick up some of the points that are being made here, what happens if you take away a lot of the government funding that goes to that postcode?
Well, the argument for the big society isn't about taking away government funding. No, that's completely wrong. Absolutely. The argument for the big society is how do we use government funding in a far, far better way? For instance, 20% of every budget is lost by the management layer it moves through. So it just follows that if you can push that money out to the front line and let the front line use it, you'll get a far more efficient outcome. I know you don't want to talk about the Olympics, but that's one of the reasons Team GB did so well, because they didn't have centralised funding. They let small groups control budgets.
OK, but you've got a bit of a problem because you've got the bronze medal economy, whereas this one's a gold medal economy.
On that point...
OK, we're going to move on.
On that point...
Sorry. On that cheap point.
On that cheap point.
Let's move on. You're watching Q&A.
I was going to respond,
By the way, I should tell our Twitter followers that technical problems are preventing us from getting your tweets on the screen right now. We're working to fix that problem as quickly as we can. Our next question comes from Sophie Raymond.
Thanks, Tony. So there's many learned thinkers that believe that human beings are innately tribal. and a sense of identity and well-being depends on belonging to a group. Now, on the flip side of that, identifying strongly with a group can often lead to blindly excluding those who aren't in your group. So I'm addressing this to Mr. Singer, but you're welcome to all participate. What can be done to encourage our politicians to transcend their political tribalism and use logic, reason and ethics, and in my particular point is to the suffering of people seeking asylum in this country?
Peter Singer.
Well, what can be done to encourage politicians to use logic, reason and ethics
We do already.
A very big question. Yeah, of course, we shouldn't be too negative. They do, but sometimes that gets sucked into just the political campaigning stance that they often take. And so I think what we need to do is actually have a better educated community and a better educated electorate that will demand that they pay more attention to the larger world in which we live. And insist at election time, tell us what you want to do for foreign aid. Tell us what you want to do about climate change. I mean, these are the big global issues that are obviously affecting us and are ethical issues that we confront in the 21st century. So I think we really need to demand that of our politicians, that they not only focus on our hip pockets, but also on trying to provide a better world for us and our children and grandchildren to live in.
Just to take the question of asylum seekers and the ethics involved in that, I mean, where do you stand on the issue of what happens when people drown trying to reach Australia? Should you stop them from coming in the first place? And this is essentially the dilemma that good people have come up against in the Australian debate.
Yes, and it is very difficult. Obviously, we should be trying to rescue them where we can, where we have the ability to do that. But, I mean, the problem, I think there is a problem with the whole system here. And again, it's a global issue. I mean, the issue of asylum seekers is a global one. And we have a convention on refugees, which in many ways is admirable. But it does mean that if people get to land on our shores, they have a greater right than someone else who is in a refugee camp and has been waiting for a decade or more to try to get somewhere. And I think, I mean, the problem really is, can we develop a global system that will say to any asylum seekers, we'll make sure that you're safe, we'll make sure you're not sent back to a country where you might be persecuted, and we'll make sure that you have, reasonable opportunities where you're going to live, to be with your family, to have opportunities for meaningful work, to have some health care and so on. But not necessarily that you will get into, particularly the country where you happen to have been able to land ashore. Right? And if we could do that, and if we could globally say, we'll all finance this together, so it's not just the responsibility of Australia, but it's the responsibility of everyone, and of course Australia contributes, I think we could actually have a global solution to the problem that would be fairer to everyone.
Prugard, reflect if you can on that question and also what's happened today.
Well, I mean, I do think there is a huge ethical dilemma in accepting people who throw their passports away and come by boat versus thousands who go to a camp somewhere else and are there for 10 years with their children. I hope I'm a good person, and that to me is a huge dilemma, that every time we allow a boat to arrive and allow them to risk their lives, then we are also excluding a family of others who might have been in a camp for 10 years. But to go back to that original question, the original part of the question, everybody tries to cheapen politics, but a democracy is only as good as the people you vote for. And what we try to do, and what the cabinet I'm part of does every day, is try to manage conflicting interests and needs. There are 20-odd million Australians, more Brits, and you're trying to manage the concerns and interests of various groups. You don't always get it right, but nobody sitting around a cabinet table thinks they are cheating, trying to cheat, trying to get away with something. They are all trying to do the best they can across these greatly competing responsibilities, and I challenge anybody to do it any better. That's what a democracy is. It's the election of ordinary people. We're all very ordinary. Nobody's any better than anybody else, and we're just trying to balance competing interests, just like a jury.
Okay. Mark Butler, I'll bring you in now, and I'll bring you in this way. There's been a shift today, and in fact your caucus essentially has voted to bring back the Pacific Solution, which is John Howard's policy on this. You're from the left.